May I please request you to take your seats? Good morning to you all. We welcome you to the first public discussion under the Property Rights Initiative at Brookings India. This initiative functions as a part of the one-of-its-kind Property Rights Consortium consisting of 4 think tanks in Delhi, and it's funded by the Omidyar Network, and we have come together to study the field of property rights in India. At Brookings, we aim to assess and test the broad agreement that secure property rights are necessary for development, expressed in terms of equitable growth and social mobility. We specifically focus on whether the legal security of property rights is a means of enhancing social mobility in advancing social, strategic, and economic outcomes. As a courtesy, I request you to remember to keep your mobile phones on silent or kindly switch them off. And today, we welcome Professor Richard Green, who is Senior Visiting Fellow for Property Rights and Urbanization at Brookings, Dr. Sumila Gulyani, who will be our discussant, the World Bank's Program Leader for Infrastructure and Sustainable Development in India, and Dr. Shamika Ravi, our Director of Research, as our panelists. I request you, Dr. Ravi, to take it from here.
Yeah. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is, well, we've had several seminars and roundtables on urbanization over the last few years, but we're trying to put some structure into it in an organized fashion across institutions in Delhi, largely because I think, one, it is a big policy priority. It should be one. It used to be one, let's say 4 years back. And somewhere down the line, we seem to be losing some of that steam. If you recall, the Smart Cities program started with a great degree of fanfare because fundamentally we do believe that cities are the engines of growth. In fact, if you look at wealth, the way it is scattered across the country, if you just look at static maps, it's very easy to tell the cities from the rest of the country. So cities and the conglomerations have emerged as engines of growth across the country, even in states which are not growing fast. Now, partly because there is a lot to learn from the Smart Cities initiative. In fact, one of our first publications 2 years back was on the Smart Cities with case studies of Ajmer, Vizag, and Allahabad, because those were the 3 cities that turned up being cases for Indo-US collaboration. And the American government, through the USTDA, was also providing technical support into putting up proposals to basically enter the smart cities. Of course, of those 3, and to the Indians in the room, you know how divergent those 3 cities are. The promise of Vizag, of course, the promise of all these cities, all the 3 remains largely unrealized if we consider the potential that each of them have. But the 3 trajectories have been very, very diverse. But beyond smart cities, there have been several initiatives in terms of attracting investments, in terms of core infrastructure development of the cities of the country. So we felt like this is a good time to bring the focus back. We work closely with the government as well. Other than advisory, we also continue to engage with officials across ministries, because urbanization is not just about one ministry. It actually involves health, it involves education, it involves of course, Niti in a very big way. So the attempt at Brookings is to be able to take knowledge from the scholarship and try and make it simpler and translate it in many ways for the policymakers to actually work with. Towards that initiative, we are very happy to welcome Richard Green. Richard has been a visiting senior fellow with us for the last 2 years. Richard is also a global leading scholar in this area, because he comes at the topic from not just a theoretical but extremely applied perspective. So we have a lot to gain from his work, not just out of the US economy but global economy. And today he's going to talk about housing, externalities, technology, and commercial real estate in the long run. And then we have, of course, Sumila, who will provide us with an Indian perspective of what his findings or his larger thesis, what kind of bearing does it have for the Indian economy? So I welcome both of you. Thank you for making time. So Richard, we'll start with you and you have 40 minutes.
Okay, thank you. And since I have a lav mic, I can walk around, which I really like to do. But where's the, no, the clicker. Ah, great, perfect.
And we'll join the audience.
Okay, and I will join the audience too. I hate being up on behind the proscenium arch. So first of all, thank you, Dr. Ravi, for inviting me to be part of this group. I really enjoy it. Her remarks make me think of a couple of things I want to say before I get into the presentation. So the first is, I first met Shamika about 10 years ago when I was teaching with her at the Indian School of Business. And I think you were just freshly out of your PhD program, is that?
I'm not that young.
Correct. Well, you were, well, I thought you were. Anyway, she was one of these people who you meet her and you think, man, that woman is going places. And so I take pride in how well I predict who are going to be successful people, and I was totally right about you. The other thing, your comment about cities, it just occurred to me that I am a pro-city bigot. I love cities, and it's for a couple of very specific reasons. Perhaps the most important of which is that when I was in high school, my father made me work on a farm one summer. And, you know, farming in the US is far more pleasant than farming in India, but it's still really, really unpleasant. And I asked him, why are you making me do this? And he said, I want to make sure that you study hard and get good grades. And I said, Dad, I do study hard and get good grades. And he says, yeah, and I want to make sure you continue to study hard and get good grades. And doing this sort of labor for a summer will probably encourage you to do that. And he's absolutely right. The last thing I ever want to do in my life, again, is farm. I am glad that other people do that for me. But of course, with the development of agriculture, basically you get mechanization, and the labor opportunities in agriculture are very, not only are there unpleasant jobs, but the opportunity for growth is quite limited. And so that means, in light of the fact that that's the way of the world, you need to have your cities be places that provide opportunity and good living conditions for people. And that's just, you cannot have, it's interesting, you can have urban development without broader development. We see that all over the world. You see it in the large cities of Africa, you see it in parts of Latin America, but you can't have the reverse. I know of no example of a country that is developed without urbanizing. Okay, so the second thing I just wanted to mention is where this talk came from is there's going to be a lot of comparison in here between the US and India. And it came out of a talk I gave to a group of Brazilians about 6 months ago, where they said to me, we want you to give a talk where you compare the US and Brazil. And I'm always loath to compare other countries to the US because it's easy to come across as an ugly American when you do that. But I was specifically asked to do it in the context of Brazil, and the Brazilians seemed to really like it. And so I thought, okay, let's try doing a similar exercise for India and see what we get as a result. So the point is to not use the US as a paragon, but to look at some of the things that have led to development in the US and see if they might have some resonance for India. And by the way, one thing about the US is in the immediate aftermath of World War II, per capita GDP in the US was lower than it is, for example, in South Africa right now. It would be what we would call a middle-income country by today's definition. To give a very specific example, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, only about 2 American households of 3 lived in a housing unit with an indoor toilet. Okay, so, or that's not quite right. With their own, there were people who had a toilet down the hall. It was indoors. But the idea that you had ubiquity of houses with their own toilets was not even the case in 1945 in the US. Now by 1960, it had changed to 98%, something like that. So that transformation could happen very rapidly. I'll give an example of another country in Korea. As recently as 1990, only about 60% of all houses had their own indoor toilet, and now it's basically 100%. So that's clearly something that really matters to day-to-day life. that could change very quickly. Okay, so I'm going to start by telling you about housing, and I'm going to talk about big pictures on quantities and prices of housing in both the US and India. I'm going to say a few things about marriage, because I think one of the most important phenomena happening around the world is the decline of marriage. You're not seeing this yet in Indian data the way you see it in other countries' data. And so whether India will be permanently unlike the rest of the world or will start to look like the rest of the world is going to be a very important thing for the future of particularly real estate uses in India, other things as well. I'm going to talk about housing finance because one of the things that puzzles me is the way the current financial crisis in India is being characterized is as if it's similar to what the US was going through 11 years ago, at least when I read the newspapers, when I read Raghu Rajan's editorial 3 or 4 days ago. And this is an area where I'm a little confused because I don't see why it would be the case actually, but I could just be very wrong about this. What I'm going to show you is just the magnitude of the debt that we're dealing with is so much smaller here relative to the economy that I'm a little puzzled about. It's a problem, so I don't want to be Panglossian. It's a problem, but I don't know why it's being looked at as an enormous problem. I'll come back to that. Then I'm going to talk about some externalities, cities, some comparisons of the Bay Area and Bangalore seem fairly obvious things to look at. And then I'm going to switch a little bit and talk about commercial real estate and how technology is changing it. And again, as India is an economy that is going to see big growth of the commercial real estate sector, how that sector may look very different from other places around the world. And again, to put it, just doing some back of the envelope math, Mumbai should have an office market that's about 5 times bigger than it is. And so in terms of, okay, this is going to happen at some point, what's it going to look like is pretty interesting. And then finally, which is not a bullet point, so just sort of some really important long-run phenomenon we see as drivers of development around the world. Okay, so this is housing in the US, and one of the things about the US that's going on that's causing housing to be expensive is if you look at housing relative to population. So this graph is building permits divided by the working age population in the US. So you can see in the global financial crisis, it dropped to levels not seen basically since the end of World War II. The recovery has been to a point where we're sort of where past recessions were. Okay, and we have a housing affordability problem in the US, and this is the principal reason why. We estimate that there's a shortfall of about 3 million housing units in the US right now, which is to say that's the number of units we would need in order to keep prices from rising in the US. But the other thing I want to point out is, and usually the shading is not showing up, okay, we had a recession here, we had a big recession here, we had a recession here, we had a recession here. Housing in the US leads the business cycle like crazy. So housing construction always precedes the broader economy, it doesn't follow it. And I've written a number of papers about this. And Ed Leamer has a line, housing is the business cycle. And yet, when I look at India, so first of all, if we look at housing starts in India, this is where we have data. This is for the 27 largest cities, or the 27 cities of the HSUI. This is the urban agglomeration. This is the total number of housing starts in 2011, which is the most recent data available. And one thing I would strongly advocate for India, in part because I want to study it more deeply, is you got to get more data here. But if you divide the number of housing starts by the population of these cities, it's about 4 per 100,000. Okay, where is that? That's still lower than this really low number in the US, which is about 6 per 100,000. Okay, so India in its cities is building about 2/3 of the rate relative to its population as the US is, when the US is building not remotely enough housing for it. And of course, India needs way more housing than the US does relative to population because the housing sector is underdeveloped. So if you want evidence that there isn't enough housing being built in India, here's Exhibit 1. But one of the things I've been frustrated, when I was at ISB, I was trying to do similar work in India that I'd done in the US from a macro standpoint to look at where is India's housing construction relative to its business cycle. And again, the frustrating part is finding good construction data for the whole of India in a time series. And I still haven't been able to find that, but I have found these two time series, which are production of total industry in India and total industry production excluding construction for India. Now the problem with this construction number is it's all construction, not just housing construction. And the US commercial construction actually lags the business cycle and housing leads it. So maybe that's the problem here. But what's striking to me is those two lines, if you look at them, are right on top of each other. You don't see one leading the other or lagging the other. And so there's no evidence here yet that housing has the sort of profound business cycle impact that it does in the US. And maybe that just reflects how small the sector still is relative to the broader economy. Okay, house prices. This is a graph that this is a picture that I would tell my students never to present because of course you can't read anything on it. So let me tell you what it is. It's the house price movements of the 100 largest cities in the United States going back to about the 1980s. And the reason it matters is if you look at these patterns, you could see in pretty much every city there was a decline in house prices, whereas this is Dallas, that was an exception. But notice pretty much everybody has had a peak. Okay, so surprisingly, house prices were very correlated through the financial crisis in the US, and that was one of the things that created a cascade. Is there was no region of the country that sort of benefited you from a diversification standpoint. The other thing is in most markets, house prices have returned to their previous peak, but not much beyond the previous peak. Okay, and so what that means is, unlike in past periods where housing has been an important generator of wealth for people, if you bought a house in the US in most cities between 2004 and 2007, you just have caught up back to where you were before, right? So you don't have this wealth boost from housing in the US. Now again, there are exceptions. This again is Dallas, Denver, wherever it is like that. But in general, now the Bay Area, again, which is here, is a big exception, and that's basically all the broader economic wealth is being channeled through a housing market that doesn't remotely build enough housing. But again, the interesting thing is if you look, sort of squint a little bit, the similarities of the patterns across these 100 cities is quite striking. The amplitudes and naders are a little different, but okay. So I thought this is the Residex index that the Bank of India is putting out for house prices. And one of the things that surprised me, I've been going around saying Hyderabad does a good job of building enough, and it turns out Hyderabad has had the biggest increase in house prices since 2013. That's as far as the data goes back. Of any of the large cities of India, prices are about 50% higher now than they were in 2013. But the interesting thing is you can see a lot of heterogeneity here. So this is Delhi, where the market has been kind of blah in terms of house prices. This is Mumbai, which has had a pretty decent run-up in prices. This is Bangalore, which has also had a pretty decent run-up. But this really surprised me. Having taught at ISB and knowing sort of the urban landscape of Hyderabad, Hyderabad is sort of the closest thing India has, I would say, to a sprawl city. I've called it like the Dallas of India. And so you would expect house prices to not go up very much, but it seems to have the strongest increase. So this is actually a healthy thing that you have this variance, so you do have diversification across housing markets. But it is interesting how, Delhi has had such sort of, if you're a property owner anyway, mediocre performance, at least over the 6 years. Now, of course, it'd be nice to have a longer time series than this, but that's what I've got. But if we look at India more broadly, this is an index of all residential property prices. This is against gross national income. This is from the BIS estimates. And you could see, in fact, going back to 2010, house prices have, in fact, gone up considerably more in India than income has, which suggests that the affordability problem is indeed getting worse. Okay, marriage. This is the marriage rate in the US from 1990 to 2016 per 1,000 population. As you can see, marriage has declined by about 30% in about 30 years, 25 years. That's not a long period of time. If I showed you this graph for Japan, Korea, Sweden, Germany, Brazil, it would look about the same. Okay. All over the world, people are getting married less. I think the reason for this is there is a guy named David Otter at MIT, a labor economist I admire very much, who has done some really excellent work showing that as women become more economically independent, they are less interested in marrying, particularly men who they do not find to be economically useful. And the experiment that he did is he looked at factory towns in the US and he looked at the marriage rate of men without college degrees before and after factory shut down. And basically when there was a factory in town, men could find spouses. And when the factory shut down, their rate plummeted. Okay, so people with same characteristics as before. So this, I think, is a permanent thing. It used to be said that, well, women are just waiting longer and they're pickier. But now, again, if you look at these countries, not so much Brazil, it's a younger country, but if you look at Germany and Japan, these are countries with lots of women in their 40s who've never gotten married. And that's kind of, you're starting to think, yeah, maybe they're never going to get married. The never married rate for 35-year-olds in the US is 20 percentage points higher than it was 20 years ago. That's a huge change in a very short period of time. Okay, now when we look at India, when we look at the marriage rate, and this is again, frustration with working with Indian data, this is the best I could do. This is the share of the total population that is married, and it's risen. Now part of it is what we really want is an adult population, but in 2011 I haven't gotten been able to suss out of the census good data on age ranges to get a decent number on this. But sort of triangulating this with other data sources, it looks like the marriage rate in India is pretty flat. You don't see this drop. People in India get married. Indians seem to still really like getting married. And so that has pretty profound implications for real estate going forward. And I want to point out two areas in particular where marriage matters to real estate. The first is housing type. Is married couple, and particularly tell your choice, married couples like being homeowners. Single people tend to prefer being renters. And so one of the things about India is it does not have a particularly well-developed rental sector. The share of people who rent in India has actually fallen considerably over the last 40 years. If people suddenly stop getting married in India, this could matter in terms of the housing choice that people want. Because basically, when you're not married, there are two things about you. You want to be more footloose so that there's an opportunity to meet a spouse at some point. If in your local marriage market you don't see who you like, you might want to move to a different marriage market. But the second thing is from a property management standpoint, if you don't have a spouse, being able to call a landlord to take care of a problem is a very valuable thing to you. Whereas if you have spouses, you could sort of diversify across property management and have one or the other take care of a plumbing problem, for example. So we know, and again, there's lots of econometrics evidence for this, other than India. I just did this for India. The only people who are more likely to be renters than anyone else in India are divorced people, which is a very small share of the population here. So if this remains as it is, India should sustain a higher home ownership rate than other countries relative to baseline. In retail, the reason it matters is when people are married, there's usually one person who does the shopping, it's the woman, and that person usually is willing to spend time shopping. Okay, there's again a diversification element to it. what we're observing in the US, so we have pretty good data from, there's a retailer who I talk to, I can't say who they are, but they share data with me, so they actually follow people's phones and get a sense of who's buying. It's very creepy, actually, if you ask me. You know, the story is like they will send coupons to expectant mothers based on their shopping behavior. That's how well they know you, right? The aisles that you're stopping and looking at suddenly, they say, oh, this woman's gonna have a baby. We should send her some coupons for baby stuff. So women linger in stores longer than men do, which means they buy more stuff that they didn't know they wanted when they walked into the store. Okay. It used to be more true than it is now. Women spend less time shopping than they did before. And I'm talking about conditional on going to the shopping mall in the first place. So this is not about Amazon. This is you've made the decision to walk into the store. Women are spending less time there. And my supposition is the reason is because they're supporting themselves, they don't have time to be shopping. And then men just don't like shopping. And so they spend as little time in stores as possible. So marriage has a pretty profound implication on the future of the retail business. Okay, housing finance. Here is the US mortgage debt outstanding. And of course, this is where we were before the global financial crisis. This is 2008. There was about 11 trillion of residential mortgage debt outstanding in the US. And the context to put that in is there was about the GDP of the US at the time was about $13 trillion. So what we call the mortgage debt outstanding to GDP ratio was about 80%. We were very levered as a country. We are now back to nearly where we were before, and again about nearly 11 trillion, but the difference is the US is a $20 trillion economy, not a $13 trillion economy, which is why I think if the US has a recession, it's not going to be real estate implosion that causes it. There's lots of equity, and here's another way to look at it, is if we look at, this is household real estate debt and household real estate equity in the US. This is the total value of housing wealth in the US, about 27 trillion. Unlike 2008, where people had far more debt than equity, now they have a lot more equity than debt. So the conditions that led to the crisis before are not there right now. Okay, here's real estate debt in India, and so the first graph is, so this is on balance sheets, housing debt, and yes, indeed, it has risen very rapidly since 2008. It's at about what? There's about 6 times as much debt now as there was in 2008. Okay, so that would seem to be a source of concern, and in fact, there are bad real estate loans that underlie the current crisis that India is facing at the moment. But here's housing debt to GDP in India, and it has gone from 3% to about 5%. Okay, so the housing debt sector as a share of the Indian economy is still really small. So let's say half of this gets wiped out. And I'm not disputing that there are clearly bad loans in the housing finance system in India right now. That's not the issue. But the issue is, what are the consequences of this? So let's say you lose half of this. That's 2.5% of GDP. Okay, that's a big deal. But the US had about $500 billion of bad debt in had about $500 billion of losses in the global financial crisis, again, out of a $13 trillion economy. So that's about 4%. Okay, so twice as big. But the other thing, and this is really important, is the US had this enormous derivatives market that multiplied basically the leverage that was in the system. And that is not here in India. And so, again, this is something you tell me whether we should be more worried about this than I am. I am, again, not suggesting that this isn't a problem, but it doesn't seem to be the kind of systemic problem that led to sort of the global meltdown that we saw in 2008. And by the way, if you look at places like Spain, and Ireland, and you saw the run-up in housing debt in those countries. Again, they got to very similar levels as the US, and India's not even close. Let's move on to externalities. Okay, so a big question facing any country in the world, including the US and including India, is what is the optimal size of a city? And so we know as cities get bigger, we get positive externalities arising from agglomeration. And there are a lot of agglomeration externalities, knowledge spillovers being among the most important. This is, I don't know how well you can see this in the back. Can you see the blue dots versus the yellow? Okay, this is the Bay Area. The blue dots are where software engineering firms are in the Bay Area. Okay, you notice that this is the San Francisco Bay Area. For those of you not familiar with it, this is San Francisco up here, the top of this peninsula. This is Silicon Valley down here. Okay, so notice that even within the Bay Area, you don't have tech scattered diffusely across it. It's concentrated in very specific places. And that's the knowledge spillover story. And it's a story, I believe, it's the idea that just by happening to sit in the right place, you overhear stuff that makes you smarter. When I was in college, there was a Chinese restaurant I liked to go to in Central Square in Cambridge, Massachusetts, because it was a place that I started out as a physics major. I wasn't smart enough to do physics, but it was a hangout for people from the MIT physics department. And so I would sit at a table and just listen to their conversations. And I didn't understand 2/3 of what they were talking about. But the third I did understand was just so cool, right? And yeah, I was eavesdropping, and that's rude, but they were talking really loud. So it's not like I was doing this. So I learned just by being in that place. Okay. So Enrico Moretti shows that if you scattered the software engineers from the Bay Area across the US, evenly distributing them, you would lose about 13% of software engineering productivity based on patent creation. Okay. So this cluster, and there are all kinds of clusters that really matter. It's on the consumption side too. You know, I love Mumbai. It's a really interesting place because you have people from all over the place who bring all of this stuff with them that makes for a very entertaining city, right? New York is like that. My hometown, Los Angeles, is like that. And we have, where LA is, I was saying to somebody before, it has the largest Filipino population outside of the Philippines, the largest Korean population outside of Korea. Among the largest Indian populations of any city in the US, I think New York may have more, but I'm not sure about that. But you get the point, and it makes LA a very interesting place, particularly if you like food and like a wide variety of food. So these positive externalities matter, but the negative externalities are real as well, the leading one of which is congestion. And by the way, people in California complain about traffic all the time. In fact, I would say it's the #1 source of conversation. Part of it is when the weather is nice all the time, you don't talk about the weather because there's really nothing to talk about. It's just you wake up, it's nice, you go to sleep, it's nice, there's not a lot to say. But traffic is variable, and basically when you go to a cocktail party, the first question somebody asks another person is, what route did you take to get here? Because people want to know, even in a Waze world, you know, is there a secret? So, but compared to Bangalore, compared to Sao Paulo, compared to Mexico City, et cetera, traffic in LA is actually not that bad. Okay, well, Bangalore, same thing. If you look at where the tech is located, okay, it's not, so the thing is, you think, okay, Bangalore is the tech sector, but even within Bangalore, the tech is not uniformly distributed. It is limited to a fair number of places. Okay, Hyderabad, you'd see the same thing. That knowledge spillover, that applies everywhere. And the flip side, this is traffic. This is why I like to show pictures like this. Okay, you think California is bad? Here's Bangalore traffic. You know, there's no, if you look, here's California traffic. You can actually see gaps between the cars. Whereas in Bangalore, I defy you to find a gap. So the question is, at what point does the bad stuff overtake the good stuff? And there's other, pollution is bad, pollution gets worse. So one of the really tough issues to deal with is really big cities are globally much better for the environment than anything else. Greenhouse gas goes down when people cluster closer together, total greenhouse gas emission. But for the people who live in those big cities, pollution is much worse than for people who live outside of cities. So that's another kind of trade-off, right? Because we all share, so the total pollution that I'll bet even Delhi produces is lower than take a bunch of villages in India, put them all together, have the same population, even with their low incomes. My guess is that the pollution from all those villages is still worse than Delhi. But in Delhi, you all share that pollution together, and so it's really bad for you. And so this is one of the tough, for thinking environmentally, it's one of the tough trade-offs in dealing with cities. And then the third thing about cities, the third negative externality generally we think of as crime. But interestingly, in the US anyway, and this is a fairly new phenomenon, crime has flipped. It used to be cities were dangerous and rural areas were safe. It's actually the reverse now. New York is one of the safest places you can be in the whole US. Crime is very low, and the other thing is it's hard to get run over by a car in New York because, again, the traffic is so bad that it's actually safer there. And the idea is in cities you have eyes on the street, and in rural areas you don't. And if rural areas are economically desperate, that will lead people to do more desperate things. I am pretty sure that there is no city in the world that is yet too big. And the reason I say that is the biggest city in the world still is Tokyo, though Indian and Chinese cities are catching up pretty fast. Tokyo is they basically managed to solve most of their externalities. It's easy to get around it. You get rich enough, you have enough development. The benefits of bigness can be still much bigger than the cost of bigness. Everyone in Japan basically wants to live in Tokyo. We know that from the migration that we see. So making sure these cities have enough infrastructure, come to this point, is critical. And that's why something I find so encouraging. I was in Mumbai yesterday seeing all these metro lines being built all at once. And again, it's not going to solve, these things never solve traffic, but it will make the city much easier to get around. That will be really good for the development of that city. Mumbai is sort of the optimal place for a metro system because it's a peninsula. You can basically serve lots of people without a whole lot of miles of track because of just the layout of the city. I think it's going to be so great when it gets done. Okay, this is what I just talked about. Just an example of I'm going to just bring in Brazil for a minute. This is Sao Paulo, which again is another mega city. So I'm trying to limit I mentioned Hyderabad is not so big, but the cities I'm talking about here all sort of have at least, say, 17, 18 million people and larger. Okay, Sao Paulo is about 20 million. This is the population density profile of Sao Paulo. The darker it is, the more dense it is. And what you could see is like pretty much any other city in the world, the middle is very dense. This is an area called Paulista. This is the most expensive area of Brazil. It's near where all the jobs are. And it's where rich people live and where favelas are. Okay, the favelas are actually not right in Paulista, but they're sort of right next by. But other than the center, look at this. You have very low you sort of have the worst possible density, no matter how you define it. And this shows the danger of getting housing policy wrong. Brazil has a program called Minha Casa Minha Vida that basically guaranteed everybody a house in Brazil. And they've done a really good job of building a lot of houses for people. But when you tell government officials that unit production is the most important thing that they do, and that's it, where are they going to build the units? Yeah, where it's cheapest to do it, right? Because that way, for a budget, they can get the most units built. And so one of the reasons for this is, it looks like this is because that's where the cheap housing is, and that's via government subsidy. The problem is, all the jobs in Sao Paulo are sort of in a triangle like this. These people have about a 2 to 3 hour one-way to commute to work. So just think about the opportunity cost of that commute, not being with your kid. Forget about the cost, forget about actually transport in Sao Paulo is really cheap. They've done a good job of saying, okay, we know we put you way out there, we're gonna give you a big subsidy for transit, but it's still, you're on a bus, it's 3 hours, that's time away from your family. That's very costly. And it makes for sort of I like Sao Paulo very much, but that's because I get to stay at a hotel in Paulista. I think for the average Paulista, it's kind of a pretty miserable life. They're still better than anywhere else in Brazil so why are people coming there? You see lots of migration from the rest of Brazil because it is by far the most productive place in Brazil. One of the things that's so striking, Brazil's per capita GDP is about 14,000 US dollars. Sao Paulo is about 20,000. So do the average, and that means the rest of the country is way poorer, right? The only other rich place basically in Brazil is Brasilia, but that's, government. Okay, technological change in real estate. This is a profound, you know what, I'm actually gonna skip this because I have only about 5 more minutes. A little bit, we can come back to this. But this is one of my favorite graphs. So I think we're gonna see less retail. Retail and office, it's actually getting replaced by industrial space. The idea is you want your inventories in warehouses and make it easier to deliver that stuff to people, or even to bricks and mortar stores quickly. So you have smaller stores, and then you have stuff go from the warehouse to the store. It gets there in 2 hours, people can pick it up at the store. That's the model, even if it's not direct. So warehousing is perhaps the most important form of real estate going forward. It's the least glamorous and probably economically the most important, other than housing. Housing, a safe, clean, convenient house is really important. And so this is one of my favorite graphs. This is the length of time it takes to build a warehouse. And basically, physically, it doesn't take much time to build a warehouse. The construction techniques allow you to put them up in about a month. So Brazil is one of the worst. Okay, it takes about a year to build a warehouse in Brazil. That's just red tape. US is very good. The best in the world is Singapore, where it takes less than a month to build a warehouse, getting all your permitting and everything else. But here's a bit of good news for India. India's pretty good. In terms of bureaucracy getting in the way of warehouse construction, India is pretty good, and even better, this is what's happened to the time series of that. The time it's taken in India to build a warehouse has been cut by about a third over the course of the last decade. That's a very positive development. It's one of these things that nobody pays attention, right? It's kind of boring, but I think it's really important. Look what happened in China. Mexico, which is doing far better as an economy than most people know. There are more Mexicans emigrating back to Mexico from the US than vice versa now, because the economic opportunities in Mexico are pretty good. They are very competitive in terms of warehouse time, so that's a plus. Okay, some long-run things that really matter. I'm just going to hit on 3 of these really quickly. Flooding is something I worry a lot about, but I don't think I need to convince anybody here that flooding, who needs convincing that flooding is a problem? Okay, believe it or not, in the US we have people, actually large numbers of people, who don't think that climate change is happening. I think they're going to have to be kind of up to here in water before they actually believe it. So I show maps of flooding in the US and I show people the maps and they still don't believe it. One guy said, oh, I live there and it never floods. I'd been where this guy, he was a private equity guy. He lived in a place called Boca Raton, Florida. And I said, no, I've been there and I've seen it flood. Anyway, but let me tell you about, this is not showing up all that well. What are the things that's transforming the United States right now? One of the leading changes of income inequality right now is the evolution of cities. And we basically have two kinds of cities. So if you can look, this, I don't know if you can make out, this is very blue, very green, whereas this is very orange. Okay, this is very green, this is very orange. Okay, this is the Bay Area, this is Washington, D.C., here's Boston. Those are green. Detroit, Cleveland, very St. Louis, very orange. Okay, it reflects the share of adults that have a bachelor's degree or more. You can explain, the most important thing in explaining the evolution of US cities relative to each other over the last 50 years is weather. Warm cities have done better than cold cities. But the second most important thing is just how many people have a college degree in those cities. And basically what happens is even people who go to college in low college degree cities move to the high college degree cities. So the winner cities are becoming more winners, and the loser cities are losing more. So human capital is probably the most important predictor. It's a cliche, but it's really true, of economic activity, and therefore the need for real estate than anything else. Okay, this is LA, for those of you who know LA. This is the west side of LA, very well educated. But basically what's happening is this is a very productive place. This area is called Silicon Beach. So this is sort of the second tech sector after the, so what's happened is a lot of tech jobs have moved from the Bay Area to Los Angeles because the Bay Area is so expensive, and you can get software engineers to move to LA. You can't get them to move to the middle of the country. They want a beach. And what's happened is, so real estate values here have gotten pushed up. There used to be some low-income people here, but they're actually getting pushed to the east. And ultimately, I think they're going to be pushed out of LA altogether to Phoenix and Las Vegas. And you see a little bit of that here. Here's Las Vegas, which is very orange. And the people who move out of the Bay Area and Los Angeles tend to land in LA, in Vegas or Phoenix, which is over here. Okay, so something to be a little aspiration about. So in India, of course, the good news, and one of the reasons I'm basically bullish on India for all of its issues is this is the share of people with tertiary education in India. It's increased by a factor of 4 since the 1970s. Again, that's very rapid. You look at sort of any measure of human capital, India has evolved very rapidly over the last 40 years. That's more important than anything else. Okay? It's still behind the world, China, and Korea, but one of the things you'll notice is Korea's starting point was not that different from India's starting point. Right? If you go back to, what is this, this is about 1980, the difference between the two was pretty small. So Korea could be, something to be aspired to. Korea now leads the world. So it's the real aspirational country. But the point is, again, in a short period of time, these things can change with appropriate policy to allow these changes. Final thing, I just like this because I've written a couple of papers about it. Because it's PDF, you're not seeing the animation. One of the biggest drivers of economic activity is air connectivity. So I was going to show this. This should have the planes flying into hubs. Cities that have good air service grow much faster than cities that don't, given common initial conditions. And I could talk about the work I've done to show that that's true, but just trust me on this one. The development of India's airport infrastructure is really important. Again, this is sort of a geeky thing. The fact that the airport here now has 3 parallel runways is a very positive development for the regional economy because it means capacity is much bigger. Mumbai, I understand they're finally building another runway after I wrote a paper for the World Bank 20 years ago about how Mumbai needed a new airport. There was a plan to put one in Navi Mumbai. You would have needed to link it and so on, but that the old airport, for a whole host of reasons, was just not adequate for a city of its size. But that air connectivity infrastructure is really critical to the development of any kind of economic development, and therefore the real estate that goes around it. And again, you find this true all over the world. The cities that were lucky enough to be hub cities in the early development of airlines have done very well. In the US, Minneapolis was kind of a small city 50 years ago. It became a hub for Northwest Airlines, which is now part of Delta. very much contributed to the development of Minneapolis. Atlanta was a sleepy little southern town. Delta put a hub in there. Frankfurt, 50 years ago, was a sleepy, some people would still say it's sleepy. I think it's better than that. Frankfurt just happened to be the place where Lufthansa put its hub. Frankfurt is now the leading finance center of Europe, right, other than London. Although I guess after the election, we shouldn't call London part of Europe anymore, should we? So that really matters too. And again, one of the things for India, if you look at air traffic in India, international traffic has about doubled in 10 years, and total traffic has tripled. Environmentally, this is not so great, by the way, but from an economic activity standpoint, it's very positive. There's my flood map. Oh, final thing, this is in the US, the population pyramid, and again, because it's a PDF, it doesn't do the animation. Basically, the US is going to turn from a pyramid into a hut. Lots of old people. That's a real problem because old people just don't make as much money, aren't as productive as younger people are. That's not ageism. That's reality. I mean, I guess it's ageism, but the point, if you observe, I think there was a piece by Arthur Brooks in The Atlantic a couple of months ago where he talked about the declining years after 60, which was really kind of hit me where I lived because it was right at the time of my 60th birthday. But the truth is, this is what I say, and I think it's true. I think I learned things I already know more deeply than before, as well as I've ever learned them. But learning new stuff is just harder. There's no question that it's harder than it used to be. And so aging countries have a real economic drag. So I think the aging in the US is going to shave about 3 to 4 percentage points off of GDP in the next 30 years relative to baseline. That's kind of a big deal. Of course, we look at India, it's a really young country. And so lots of people have just begun, you you look at these cohorts here, these are your most productive years, about ages 40 to 55. That's when people usually come into their stride in terms of what they contribute to the economy. Lots of people are going to be going into that group into the next 10 to 15 years. So, and finally, I worry about trade. If the trade system blows up, which, on the one hand, we're going to have Brexit. On the other hand, Trump apparently is going to make a deal with China. I don't know. That could throw everything else into disarray. And I'm past my time, but thank you for your kind attention and for having me here.
Great. Good afternoon. I'm going to follow Richard. It's a real pleasure to be here and a real privilege to be on a panel with Dr. Ravi and with Dr. Green, Professor Green. He really is a luminary in the field, and so I thought this morning as I was looking through his presentation, the last thing I can do is critique it, like he's a guru in the field. So I thought what I might do instead of trying to debate with him or discuss some of those points, I thought what I would do is talk about its implications for India. He did a very nice comparison of India and the US, and I thought I'd maybe put a few things on the table that go from the micro to the macro, right? And I want to start with a sentence he said that Sao Paulo shows you the risks of getting housing policy wrong, right? And getting the ideas about density wrong. And I think we are getting it wrong here in India. I think we're getting our approach to housing and housing policy wrong. And I'm going to try and share a couple of things that I think are not right about it, and they're not so difficult to shift. And maybe we'll have a Q&A and we can discuss some of it more. I think the first thing to realize, and that all of us know and Dr. Ravi said, is India's urbanizing really fast. But its numbers are hidden. So, the census data suggests it's only about 30 or 33% urban. But if you look at agglomeration indices,
and night lights and things like that, India is already over 50% urban, but it is tagged rural. So you have an incredible growth in what are called census towns that are areas which have urban characteristics but are labeled and governed as rural areas, right? And so essentially, by understating what is urban and not tackling the urban governance issues, we are getting cities that are not doing very well. And within that, how we approach housing determines how our cities will be structured and whether they will have sprawl or density, access to jobs or lack thereof, and things like that. So the one thing I want to say is that I want to start with this, that in much of the developing world, we have what we call our vulnerable cities, and they have 3 bad S's. So if you look from space, you have the left-hand side, which are night lights images. The white stuff is what was there, say, in 2010, early 2000s, and the red is what was there in 2010, right? And so they are sprawling very fast, and they're going linearly most of the time. So that's sprawl. You're looking at it from a satellite. You zoom in into those cities, you get what I would call spatial segregation, division between where the poor live and the rich live and the access they have. And if you zoom into some of these lower income kind of neighborhoods, you get slums which have very poor living conditions. So I think that's the urban challenge, how to have less sprawl, less segregation or more inclusion, and better living conditions. And the question that arises is, how do you do that for the next billion or the next 2 billion plus of urban residents in the world, a huge fraction of which are going to be here in South Asia and India, and the other in sub-Saharan Africa, and how can our cities do better? So the first point I want to make is housing is not just about the unit. It's a point that Richard also made. And I'm going to argue, I'm going to present a framework that I find useful. So normally when governments think about housing, they think about the unit, the structure. But I would argue it has 4 dimensions. We call it the living conditions diamond. There's the unit, there's infrastructure, roads, water, electricity, all of that. There's tenure. This is a property rights seminar. Do you own? Do you rent? Is your tenure secure? How long do you live there? How mobile are you? And finally, the neighborhood and location. Is this a rich neighborhood, a poor neighborhood, which is what we have nowadays? But more importantly, is it a precarious neighborhood? Is it susceptible to flooding? Is it next to a dump site? Are these the equivalent of favelas in Venezuela? They're not called favelas there, the slums in Venezuela, where landslide wiped out entire settlements. So they are precarious neighborhoods, and their location matters in terms of access to jobs and other kinds of features, whether they have access to schools and health clinics, whether they are safe. And I'm going to argue that, I have argued in papers that I have written, that all of these are connected. So if you make a change in one, it affects the other, and it's a dynamic diamond. So the last thing you want to do is think only about the unit. There are a spectrum of housing options, and again, Richard referred to some of these. On the extreme low end, on the left, are slums. On the extreme right end are multi-story apartments, the very glitzy ones like you see in Gurgaon now, like Magnolia and Camellia and whatever, the extreme upper end. In the middle are things like shared housing, things like serviced, I'm sorry you can't read this, this is very weird. Serviced plots and houses. So Delhi and a lot of the DLF housing in Gurgaon in the early 90s gave you serviced plots, and people built their own houses, and over time these have been densifying. And there's a huge spectrum. But what's really interesting is, similarly, there's a whole spectrum of interventions for low-income people by governments. On the extreme left, and again, sorry, you can't read it, is things like slum upgrading. On the extreme right is delivery of public housing apartments by governments. And if you, what I've argued elsewhere is that each of these solutions that governments or private sector has in trying to solve the housing problem works on different aspects of the living conditions diamond, right? And your strategy defines your entry point and your result, actually. So I'm just going to, so this is a shot of public housing, not from here. I just didn't have time to update the photographs. This is public housing being delivered, say, in Nairobi, Kenya. And you can recognize it. Indian housing looks the same. It's very high end, and it's meant for the lowest income people, and it is not affordable. So very few governments can afford to build this for the mass of poor people or the lower incomes that you have in places like India and Kenya. This is what the private sector builds for poor people outside of slums. These are dorms in Gurgaon. So each one is a housing unit. Sometimes they have a shared toilet at the end, similar to what Richard was talking about in the US. Independent toilets didn't exist. So this is like dormitory housing outside of Gurgaon. I'm borrowing this image from research done by another colleague, I think in CPR. It was on the web. I got this image from there. So I think what we need to do is plan for this new influx of this growth that we're going to see in urban India and in other parts of the world. And here I want to share with you one example. So let me go back. I'm going to share one example of a program that the World Bank had done in India in the 70s and 80s, and, but also in 50 other countries in the world. It spent about 15 billion, and then it abandoned these approaches in the early 90s. It was called Sites and Services. Abandoned these approaches in the early 90s because the idea was they don't work. A few years ago, like 2015 or so, when I was still living in the US, I was invited back by a colleague here in India to come and look at what happened to these programs that the bank had funded in Mumbai and Chennai. So these projects had closed at least 20 years ago. The last project had closed in 1996, and here we were in 2015. And I want to use it to show you certain features that were built into this and the results, and how our housing today does exactly the opposite. Our housing policy does exactly the opposite. So what it did was, the Sites and Services approach worked on all those three: infrastructure, tenure, and neighborhood development, and left the construction of the unit to the people. The idea was that if you give them plots with services, water, toilets, whatever, they would build their own housing. And the World Bank alone spent about $1 billion over this period between the 70s to the mid-90s in 11 projects, 27 cities, built about 279,000 plots. If you take the family size at the time of about 4, it was over 1 million people who were going to benefit from this. The shaded things show the states in which these projects were run, or programs, and the dots, Mumbai, Chennai, Kolkata, Kanpur, were some of the cities where this was done. So we went and visited sites in Mumbai and Chennai, 15 out of the 28 sites that the World Bank had worked on. And this is a site drawing from Mumbai from that time, from the 70s. It's a blueprint. And what I can indicate to you here is what they did was they introduced something that was against the planning regulations. At the time, the minimum plot size in India was 150 to 200 meters square. Below that was not allowed by planning regulations. These programs introduced a very small plot, 21 to 33 meters square, 21 in Mumbai and 33 meters square as the minimum plot size in Chennai. They created variable plot sizes, so they made neighborhoods that scaled from 21 to 223 meter squares, plot sizes. And the idea was that the smallest ones would go to the poor and would have a very high subsidy, and the bigger ones would be sold at market rates to people who could afford it. And overall, your whole development would not need any subsidy. That was the thinking. They were spatially economical, so in those developments, they reduced the size, the proportion of land allocated to roads and to open spaces to about 30%, whereas in other developments following planning regulations, it was almost 60%. So when you do that, you increase the amount of saleable land and therefore reduce the cost per unit, right? They decided to make it mixed use. They said we will create shops, clinics, schools, cinema, all of this. And like Richard said, they were land was available only on the outskirts of the city, so they went there. And they aimed for cost recovery in these developments, all right? So just very quickly, what they did was you have different sizes of roads and stuff. These are the very small plots of 25 meters square in Mumbai, open space. Then they had these big plots where in Mumbai they built multi-story housing for the higher income groups. There was space for a cinema and other kinds of plot sizes. So this is a zoomed in area. Sorry, I should have known that it's there. So the 780 meter squares were multi-story cooperative housing in Mumbai. The 25 meter square were for the poor people. So like I said, essentially these were abandoned because by the time the projects closed, all you had was empty sites with plots. So this is what they looked like in Chennai in the early days, just plots with toilet cores, right? Then in the mid-80s, some people had started to come, like hut type of features. And this is what it looked like when I visited in 2015. So these had been abandoned because people thought it's too far, they'll never come. They're too poor, they'll never build. Those that build won't be poor, it leaks and all of this other stuff. So the idea was incremental housing, and it took time, but this is what it looked like. And because most of you live in and around here, you know that even private developments like Gurgaon looked empty in the early 90s, and look what it looks like now. So even middle income and rich people take time to build and move into settlements that are on the outskirts. So this is Mumbai. On the right-hand side were the structures as they looked like in the early days and still exist in 2015, but very few. And most of them look like what you have on the left. And like I said, there was mixed use. So on the left is Mumbai with housing on, commerce on the lower floors. And in Chennai on the main road, it was planned into the storyline. And this is satellite imagery and work that was done by a colleague of mine. So on the left is a sites and services development. The little white things are the 25 square meter plots that still exist as they were. The bigger units are multi-story housing that was built at the time. And on the right side is the so-called higher income neighborhoods in the vicinity in Mumbai. Less planned, more vertical, less roads, less mixed income, right? This is, again, if you look at the images on the left, Mumbai, on the right, Chennai, the orange is sites and services sites, and you can see the fabric, which is not sites and services sites. So that is just regular, whether low income, middle income, or high income. We are not planning our cities, and we need to plan our cities. And so, yeah, this is the wrong image here. So essentially, this thing worked, and it has certain implications of how we go forward. I'm not saying we need to do sites and services. What I'm saying is there are certain aspects of this, and we are doing exactly the opposite on how we do housing and housing developments and the planning and regulations that we put in place. So planning for sustainable growth, the thing that I would like to argue the next billion the world over, and India included, you're going to need both redevelopment and expansion. So it's not like you can fit the future residents of Delhi in its current space. So it's going to expand, but you need to redevelop and densify. You need new kinds of affordable housing plots. Things like small plots and other such innovations are required, and you have to remember that incremental development is a slow process. So you can't just give them a plot and say it's a waste of land and money because it took 10 years for them to build a house. But neighborhoods are the key unit of action. So housing policy, private, public efforts that focus only on building units are missing the point. You have to focus on the neighborhood. And you have to plan and connect these neighborhoods, and you have to aim for right features. Our housing units, when we give permissions to developers, are to build gated communities that are only housing. We fine them if there's a shop, a commerce allowed in there. We fine them if there's not sufficient setback. We fine them if they don't allocate 60 or 70% of the land to beautiful roads. Who can afford that? Only the upper income. No? So you want to encourage mixed income and mixed use. You want to have dense, connected to transit, walkable, serviced, livable neighborhoods. And it sounds like a pipe dream, but I'm showing you examples from Mumbai and Chennai where this exists and it was planned for. And you can get that way inclusive, compact, and livable cities. I'm just going to do one animation to show you the difference between what is going on and what I'm proposing. So this is the way it is. Normally, 2 cities. There's a roads project that will come and connect those 2. Then there'll be a regional roads project that will few more. And then everybody comes and builds along these roads and you get sprawl. This is business as usual. This is what we're doing today. This is how you get Sao Paulo. It's a mistake, especially if you give subsidies to developers to build way out, just like one pillar of PMJ, Prime Minister Housing Program, is doing right now. What I'm saying is you need to shift to an approach that takes the neighborhood as the unit of action. So you think in advance when these roads are going, where the neighborhoods are going to be, and what you're going to have in them. And you're going to have to design and work on redevelopment within cities with these kinds of features that I just talked about. And that way, we'll have better cities. Thanks a lot.